My name is Everett Piper. I have the privilege of being the president here at Oklahoma Wesleyan University, and I would like to give you the context for why I believe we need to have this discussion. Education matters. You're here today because you believe that. You're here today because you believe that ideas have consequences. You're here because you believe that good education and good ideas will breed good behavior and good society and good culture and good community. You're here because you believe that bad ideas and bad education will result in the opposite. And therefore, regardless of your view on Common Core, you probably believe that education matters. And I am sponsoring this today, and Oklahoma Wesleyan is engaged in this today because we believe that we need to argue for the best of education. And we need to define what that education should be, and the definition is going to lend itself to what we actually do in the classroom. I would ask you to ask yourselves these questions. Is education for a career, or is it for character? Is education for money, or is it for morality? Can we have those dichotomies in the way we define education? And if so, which side of the fence do you stand on? I would argue that it's for both, obviously. I would argue that any education that lends itself just to the quantitative, whether it be a career or whether it be financial, is missing the deeper, more time-tested values of education in the qualitative, and that is the morality and the ethics that endears itself to a free society and a free people. This is a liberal arts institution. This is a Christian liberal arts institution. We believe in liberty and liberation. We believe in freedom of thought and freedom to be what God created us to be. And we believe that the Liberal Arts Academy was founded, let's say, in the 1100s as an education that would free society from the consequences of its sin and the sin of others. With that as the context, I'm proud to sponsor this debate on Common Core, because at the end of the evening, I hope you've asked yourself some good questions and asked the two participants who hold opposing views on Common Core, what's the best model for education? What is going to educate the next generation of leaders to lead toward freedom and liberty and justice that will give us the society that we've all enjoyed and we want to continue to enjoy? Which model will do so? Now, I have my own opinions, and in fairness to the two participants, I'm going to try to refrain from offering those opinions. But we should want the best education. Not just average, not just good enough. We should want the best of education. And thus this discussion of Common Core is important because it's the curriculum. It's the ideas that are going to be fed to the next generation of leaders. And I'll close with this, and I'm going to pray for you, okay? I would argue we've got ideological cancer in our culture. And you don't cure cancer by putting Band-Aids on it. You cure cancer by going to the carcinogens that you're consuming in the first place. And if the ideas that we are consuming are bad ideas, then we're going to have cultural and ideological cancer. So don't put a Band-Aid on it. Cure it. Heavenly Father, thanks for the opportunity to get together and talk about truth. You said you are the way, the truth, and the life. And tonight we want to come before you and ask for wisdom in understanding what the way and the truth is that will give us a free and robust life. I pray that you'll be with the two participants and also be with Brandon as we debate these things this evening. In Jesus' name, amen. Brandon?
Thank you, Dr. Piper. Thank you all for coming out on this chilly evening to explore the question, Common Core Chaos. My name is Brandon Dutcher. I'm Senior Vice President at the Oklahoma Council of Public Affairs in Oklahoma City, although I am a Bartlesville native, and I'm thrilled to be back on this beautiful campus at this wonderful institution, which is growing by leaps and bounds under the leadership of Dr. Piper. Even though this has been dubbed in the promotional materials as the greatest fight in education history, I don't think it would be appropriate for me to say, let's get ready to rumble. Rather, I'm simply going to introduce these two, and then each speaker will give an opening statement. They'll each be asked a series of questions, and each will have 3 minutes to answer. Then I'll ask a couple of questions that I received via Twitter from people around the country, and then we'll take questions from the audience with Dr. Piper having the microphone. And then lastly, each will close with a brief closing statement. Going first this evening will be Mrs. Jenny White from Oklahoma City. Mrs. White is a board member of Restore Oklahoma Public Education, or ROPE. ROPE was formed in 2008 as a public education watchdog group. Its mission is to return public education to parental control through local control at the district level. ROPE was very instrumental, to say the least, in the repeal of the Common Core state standards in Oklahoma, and the organization is now keeping an eye on the development of the new standards, as well as continuing to educate lawmakers and the public about student data collection and other issues. Our next presenter is Mr. Mike Petrilli. Mr. Petrilli is an award-winning writer, and he's president of the Thomas B. Fordham Institute, one of the nation's most influential education policy think tanks. He's the author of the book, The Diverse Schools Dilemma, A Parent's Guide to Socioeconomically Mixed Public Schools, and he is the co-editor of Knowledge at the Core, Don Hirsch, Core Knowledge, and the Future of the Common Core. Mr. Petrilli is also a research fellow at Stanford University's Hoover Institution and is the executive editor of Education Next. He lives with his family in Bethesda, Maryland. Thank you for coming all this way. Mrs. White, the first 7 minutes are yours.
Excellent. Before I begin, as the wife and daughter of men who have served in the armed forces, I would like to thank all veterans for their service on this Veterans Day. Next, I want to thank Dr. Piper very much for his very gracious hospitality in extending us the use of Lions Performing Hall this evening. Thanks to you as well, Mr. Dutcher, for loaning us your very capable moderating skills. And thank you also here in attendance, those that are here in attendance and those that are watching via the internet at home tonight. Finally, I'd like to thank you, Mr. Petrilli, for coming all the way from Maryland to debate this ordinary Oklahoma mom on the state of chaos that you actually assigned Oklahoma public education during the recent Intelligence Squared Embrace the Common Core debate in New York, following Oklahoma's repeal of the Common Core state standards and the loss of our NCLB waiver. I'm hoping that you'll come away from your time here in Bartlesville convinced that it's not the loss of the NCLB waiver itself that's quite an excellent example of the butterfly effect, but more Common Core itself. In a way, I actually agree. There has been much chaos surrounding the repeal of the Common Core from Oklahoma and the loss of our waiver. First, however, we must consider the general chaos resulting from the Oklahoma State Department of Education taking billions of dollars from the pockets of tax-paying Oklahomans for public education, only to focus zealously on meeting the desires of the Federal Department of Education, though their monetary contribution hovers somewhere around 10% of Oklahoma's entire education budget. Why should Oklahoma, or any state for that matter, give up any part of their control over education to the federal government for such an insignificant investment? I seem to recall an adage about a silk purse in a sow's ear here. Then we must consider the specific chaos resulting from state policymakers remaking Oklahoma education, tailoring it to fit a federal government blueprint that includes Common Core state standards, teacher accountability measures, and a state longitudinal database, all which reinforce the standards, in order for school administrators to receive flexibility from essentially a meaningless 100% student proficiency standard set in English and math, prescribed by a law Congress refuses to reauthorize. What about flexibility for students, parents, and teachers to have standards and resulting curricula that works best for them? After all, is public education about serving administrators or kids? Finally, there's the orchestrated chaos designed to fit the narrative that schools will lose money as a result of the loss of our waiver. In truth, Oklahoma lost no money at all as a result of losing our waiver. Once the waiver was lost, we moved back under NCLB regulations that prescribed the redirection, not removal, of 20% of Title I funds only if the state fails to meet adequate yearly progress. Considering this amounts to a mere 0.5% of the total state education budget, why chaos? Of course, there's definitely more chaos to be found in the system, however. Legislation enacting Common Core in Oklahoma was completed before the standards were even ready to be filed in final draft. People don't buy cars without a test drive, or chaos is ensured to ensue. States shouldn't buy standards sight unseen either. Attempting to align all schools across the nation to one set of untested, unproven standards based upon unsubstantiated claims that they're higher or college ready has created testing and teacher chaos for states. Emphasizing college readiness has created chaos for elementary kids who now struggle through developmentally inappropriate material, all in the name of higher standards. Emphasizing college access is creating job market chaos as tens of thousands of skilled labor jobs here in Oklahoma go unfilled as students are funneled more towards college than job training. Writing and enacting and facilitating education policy on the back of checks written by a billionaire computer entrepreneur non-educator can do nothing but cause chaos as educators scramble to enact policies in actual classrooms that were written in a vacuum. Some Oklahoma administrators have created chaos in the lives of their teachers by forcing them to teach Common Core under a different name, though it's against the law via mandate of the people, because students need to be taught to a Common Core aligned SAT or ACT or AP, or because we just bought Common Core aligned books, or we've already spent too much money on Common Core teacher training, etc. Because Common Core has been tied up into a neat little ball with nearly every other federally offered education reform, we'll have to endure the chaos of resurrecting Heracles to cut off all its heads. Though national educational tests and standards are contrary to federal law, chaos has resulted from the federal government paying testing companies to write a national Common Core test, which costs too much, is hard to grade, and takes up too many days out of the classroom to give. The high-stakes test and punish cycle, meant to provide Common Core with its rigorous accountability, has become chaos for parents, kids, and district IT employees, many of whom would rather sit in the unemployment line than go to work on McGraw-Hill online testing day. The definition of chaos is frustrated students who can't understand overly complicated, confusing Common Core math lessons, and frustrated parents who can't help because they don't understand it either. Parents and families reordering their lives and budgets to pull kids into private or home schools because their neighborhood public school is no longer working for them is obviously chaotic. And finally, chaos is the result in countless families as countless mothers and dads in countless states have set aside their primary duties of children, home, and office to spend countless hours researching why their kids suddenly hate school or math or reading, only then to spend countless hours educating fellow parents and government officials that enacted Common Core legislation about the chaotic nightmare that is Common Core. So in conclusion, Mr. Petrilli, there is chaos here in Oklahoma, but it's chaos that arrived on the heels of Common Core long before the loss of any federal carrot and stick mandate. And I'll be happy when we've driven a stake through all of its hearts and it ensured that it never comes back to cause any chaos again in the lives of Oklahoma taxpayers and kids.
Thank you, Mrs. White, and your timing was exquisite. I was watching my stopwatch. Mr. Petrilli.
Great. Thank you very much. First of all, thank you so much to Dr. Piper for having us here and hosting us, to Jenny for inviting me to come here today, and Brandon for moderating. You know, a lot of people have asked me, why have you decided to, agree to this debate? Most likely, it may not be the friendliest of audiences. Not to mention after my recent haircut, I look a lot like Vladimir Putin, so that's not going to help me in person with anybody. And I would explain, first of all, I came because Jenny invited me, right? We are having a vigorous debate on this topic, but it's important, I feel, and I think Jenny would agree, that in this country we demonstrate that though we may disagree on issues, we don't have to be disagreeable, and it's important to show respect to one another and to have a full hearing of these ideas. the other reason is that I really want to understand where Jenny and her colleagues at Rope and similar organizations are coming from. Because I think on many issues, certainly on many education issues, I think that Jenny and I see the world very similarly. Right? I think we both agree that our public education system could be performing a lot better than it is today. Certainly that's the case in Oklahoma. All of the national, does this sound okay? I'm hearing such echoes. Let's see.
It's cutting in and out a little bit, it sounds like.
I thought, is that any better? Away from now.
I don't think it was the problem of where it was placed.
Yeah. Why don't I, should I try this?
Please do.
Is that better?
Oh,
yes,
goodness.
Okay. We'll give you that. You can fix that while I'm... Okay. So again, it was really important to me to come to hear what Jenny and her colleagues had to say about why they felt so passionately about pulling out of the Common Core. Because on so many issues, I'll get that in a minute. I'll get that next time. Okay. I think on many issues we agree. We agree that the public education system could be a whole lot better than it is today, that it could be higher performing. Certainly in Oklahoma, where you look at the national test score results and you compare Oklahoma to similar states, and there just has not been a whole lot of progress over time. Unlike other states like, say, Florida or Massachusetts, where we've seen big gains across the board for students over the last couple of decades. There's been some progress, but it's been pretty moderate. And so I think she feels, as I do, that we could be doing a lot better. We both agree that parental choice is hugely important, that it's a fundamental right, and that it's also a fundamental way to improve our public education system, that empowering parents is something that we absolutely have to do. As parents, we definitely want to have that sense that we are in control of our own kids' education. I also think my understanding is that Jenny supports the notion of standards. There are some in the libertarian movement, I don't know where Brandon comes down in this, but that really make the argument that we don't need standards at all, that all we need is school choice, and any kind of standards from the state level is inappropriate. I don't think that's where Jenny's coming from, that the understanding is saying, look, we have a public education system. The taxpayers pay for this system. It is appropriate for the taxpayers to say, here are the results we want our education system to get. And it is appropriate for the standards to be related to what comes next for kids, right? For success in college, for success on the job, which of course, as Dr. Piper said, is not everything. And as parents, we know it is not everything. But it is one of the major reasons that we support a public education system, is we know that we all benefit with a well-educated citizenry. And part of that certainly is making sure that kids are ready for success as they start their careers, as they finish their educations. So I think we agree on a lot of things. We would also agree that the Common Core standards are not perfect. I think we would agree, though, that the old Oklahoma standards, which are now the new Oklahoma standards, the past standards, are not perfect either, right? So I'm trying to understand, when I look at all of that picture, and I add up the pros and I add up the cons, to me, it's clear to me that I think the pros outweigh the cons. That the pros here are that we finally have momentum in this country towards a set of standards that are higher than what most states had before, that are linked to success in college or on the job, right? That, and most importantly, in my view, that are leading to a set of assessments, to standardized tests, that are finally going to tell the truth about how our students are performing. It's finally going to fix this huge problem that we've had in this country, where we've got all this testing going on and all this so-called accountability. But because the standards in most states were set so low, and because the tests, especially the tests, were set at such a low level, we were sending false signals to parents that everything was fine. All right. Oklahoma had a decent set of standards. The past standards are pretty good. We can talk later about some specific concerns with them that I think you would share, like they don't demand teaching standard algorithms. They allow calculators to be used in very early grades. They don't demand a close study of American literature, so on and so forth. Okay. But the standards on the whole were pretty good. But Oklahoma's test, like most states, was set at an incredibly low level. And so we sent the message to lots of families out there that their kids were doing fine, that their kids were on grade level, that they were on track, when in fact that wasn't the case at all. All it meant was that your child was learning at some very basic minimal standard, but we weren't good about explaining that. So we surprised a lot of people, a lot of young people, when they went through the system. For 12, 13 years, they passed all these state tests. They got a high school diploma from Oklahoma Public Schools. They got good grades. Everybody was saying, you're doing great. And then they go to a community college and they end up in remedial education. Or they go to apply for a job and they are told, I'm sorry, I want to give you this job, a technical job, one of those middle skill jobs, right? That I agree, by the way, we should not be having everybody go to college. But they go for one of those jobs and they're told, I'm sorry, you don't have the reading or the writing or the math skills that you need today to get one of these decent paying technical jobs, even though our system has told you all these years that you're doing great. We finally had momentum in Oklahoma, and we still have momentum in 40 plus other states towards higher standards and more challenging assessments that are going to finally tell the truth to parents and to kids about how they're performing, right? That's finally going to tell people, hey, if you want to be on track for those good paying jobs or for college, which again is not everything, but if you want that, you need to know that you need to, we need to up our game here, right? And in my opinion, that is a very appropriate approach for conservatives to take. High standards, transparency, telling the truth. Now, I am here to understand again what Jenny's concerns are and what your concerns are. Is it about the federal government? I totally get that. I respect that. My own view is that the federal government should have nothing to do with this. I've been clear that I actually think Oklahoma has a great case for a lawsuit over this waiver thing, and that it should sue the Department of Education and it could win. That the Department of Education has overstepped its bounds. Right? Is that what it is? Is it Bill Gates? I don't quite understand that one as much, because I figure on the conservative side we tend to respect successful entrepreneurs, But if the sense is that powerful people like Bill Gates are taking power away from us, I get that. I understand that. That's a legitimate concern, right? Is it the data privacy? You all have passed a great data privacy bill here that's made it clear that no data can leave the state of Oklahoma. Is that what it is? I want to understand what it is, because I do worry that we have missed a great historic opportunity in Oklahoma to finally move towards these higher standards and these much better tests. And the chaos that I have referred to is what happens next? What test is Oklahoma going to give this spring? My understanding is that it's still under development. There's a lot of questions. It's November, right? What standards are going to guide public schools in Oklahoma? You've got the old Oklahoma standards, which are kind of pretty good, but have some problems. The law now calls for a new set of standards, so a third set of standards in so many years, right? Are we sure those standards are going to turn out well? I don't know. Maybe. I hope they do, and I sincerely do hope that the standards turn out well and that Oklahoma figures out how to get to a high-quality assessment that's going to tell the truth to parents. But to me, it feels like a huge gamble, a huge risk, a huge unknown. You had momentum towards standards and tests that were very good. Maybe not perfect, but very good. You now are looking into the great unknown about whether you're going to be able to get to the other side with strong standards and with strong tests, or whether you're going to go back to the days where you've got so-so standards and a pretty mediocre test that doesn't tell the truth to parents about how their kids are really performing. To me, that kind of risk, that kind of gamble does not sound conservative. And now, again, you've moved forward in Oklahoma. I hope you figure out a way to get to those higher standards and tests. But I certainly hope that people in other states recognize that pulling back on the Common Core without a very clear path towards higher standards and rigorous assessments is a big risk, can lead to chaos, at least in the short term. That in Oklahoma, again, big question marks on which standards are using, on which tests are using. And if we want to have a conservative approach for our kids, if we want to make sure that we have a system with real transparency so parents have good information, staying the course may be the more conservative thing to do. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Petrilli. And one of our first questions ties into something you mentioned. One of the most effective arguments in Oklahoma against Common Core proved to be that it represents a federalization, a nationalization of education. Indeed, once the phrase Obama Core started making the rounds in this state, where Mr. Obama twice won 0 of 77 counties, it was pretty much game over. But are those concerns legitimate? Is it fair to characterize Common Core as Fed Ed? Mrs. White, we'll let you go first. 3 minutes.
Excellent. Well, I got to say, it's absolutely a fair cop. As I've written frequently, there were 4 separate overlapping programs established under the Obama administration Department of Education that make up what I like to call the 4 pillars of America's education reform. These are Common Core state standards, teacher accountability measures, turning around failing schools, and instituting a state longitudinal database system to track children across all ages and stages of the educational spectrum and into the workforce. States had to sign on to all 4 of these foundational programs at some level in order to get state fiscal stabilization funds in 2009, when everybody just needed funds to be competitive for the Race to the Top grant funds, or to qualify for waivers from the provisions of No Child Left Behind. Those states could substitute their own standards as long as they were deemed college and career ready by state institutions of higher learning. It's really no secret that entropy favors the easy road. I mean, why would states reinvent the wheel when they could simply take what was offered and move on to the teller? Doesn't the fact that a vast majority of states signed on to Common Core since 2009 have something to say about the veracity of that statement? Consequently, as state standards were cast aside in favor of standards favored at the federal level as a part of a federal government extortion exchange rate for money or flexibility, the Common Core state standards predominated across the nation. If the standards predominated across the nation and were an integral part of federal government programming, what other definition for Common Core state standards can there be but nationalized education standards? In the final analysis, it really matters not whether the standards were penned by a private source or inside the walls of the Department of Education if the federal government adopts them as their own and then uses them as a fulcrum for moving education policy from a local endeavor to a more localized locus, centralized locus.
Thank you, Mrs. White.
Let's see. Any better? Is this working now?
That sounds good.
All right. Excellent. Thank you. So let's start a little bit earlier in the process, right? Actually, much earlier in the process, because at the Thomas B. Fordham Institute, we've been tracking state standards since the late 90s. And in fact, the very first report we ever put out in 1997 was called State English Standards, written by Sandra Stotsky. And we have been watching the development of this reform now for almost 20 years. And when we first started, the interest was in saying, okay, the states are all developing their own standards, reading and math, eventually science, social studies. And as a group that believed in a very traditional approach to education, we wanted to see, were these standards high quality? Were they rigorous? Were they clear? And so we started doing these studies over time. And what we found was that every year we do these reports, and most of the states were publishing terrible standards, right? But there were a handful that were pretty good. And as time went on, a couple of exemplars came out. Massachusetts, Indiana, California, a couple others that were very good. But unfortunately, most other states continued along with their pretty lousy standards. Well, throughout the 2000s, there wasn't a lot of progress, and it probably was largely because of federal policy. The No Child Left Behind Act was saying states had to get all kids to proficiency, but let states define proficiency as they wanted, and so created this incentive for states to set the bar very low, and that's exactly what happened. Now, by about the mid-2000s, some groups, including ours, started saying, look, this is crazy. We've got this serious problem out there where we are setting these very minimal standards. And while we're seeing some progress for the lowest performing kids in the country, we're not seeing any progress for kids in the middle or the highest achieving kids, which is understandable because states are setting their standards so low. So what can we do to get states to move towards these higher standards? Maybe if we got states to work together to provide political cover to one another, that these politicians who are afraid of setting a high bar, having test scores come out showing all these kids failing, maybe if they gave each other political cover, we could start to set the bar higher. And so there started to be this conversation about, could we set higher standards through common standards, at least in reading and math? And that started the conversation. Now, by 2007, 2008, state superintendents and governors were starting to meet to have this conversation, saying, well, should we give it a try? They had all just recently come up with a common standard for measuring graduation rates. So there was some sense that, okay, if we can do that for grad rates, maybe we can do that for standards. So by the time the Obama administration came in 2009, this process was underway. It was led by state superintendents. It was led by the governors. It was funded largely by the Gates Foundation, right? But all private. Everybody's saying we got to keep the federal government out of this. And there was some momentum. And then, pick up the story. As Jenny said, absolutely. The federal government came in and politicized it. Decided and raced to the top to create this incentive that if you adopt Common Core, you have a better chance of winning. And there's no doubt that that led many, many states to get on board. And it also has led this to become such a hot, polarized topic. I wish that we had screamed bloody murder back then when the Obama administration announced this policy and said, no way in heck, stay away from the Common Core. But it happened. Okay, so that now happened. It has played itself out. Some states won race to the top, other states did not. Now the question is, how can we, and particularly as conservatives, say the federal government should have nothing to do with this? All right, but now it should be up to the states to decide which standards they want to embrace. And the question there is, are the Common Core high-quality standards? And I hope we get a chance to talk about that. And are they stronger standards than what was in place before? And is there a chance to get to much better tests, assuming we're going to continue to have testing in this country, than what we had before?
Thank you. Is Mr. Petrilli cutting in and out, or can you hear him well? Okay, thank you. Our next question. Some parents who choose non-public educational options worry that Common Core will limit these options for their kids. They say, for example, if certain exams, SAT, ACT, advanced placement, and so forth, are aligned to the Common Core, then this will increase the likelihood that private school students, homeschool students will have to follow the Common Core. Are these concerns legitimate? Will private schools and homeschooled students be compelled to accept national standards and tests? We'll let you go first, Mr. Petrilli.
Sure. No, thank you. It is certainly the case that we've heard from the ACT folks and the SAT folks that they do intend to align their assessments to at least some of the principles in the Common Core. A couple of things to consider. First of all, let's be honest. Pulling Oklahoma out of the Common Core hasn't changed that at all, right? These are private organizations. These are private organizations not driven by federal policy, but they've got their own boards. Now, what is it actually going to mean? Is it something that parents need to worry about? My own view is if you look at, for example, the changes to the SAT that they're talking about, they're all quite reasonable. They're saying that they're going to make sure, for example, that students draw evidence from the text. This seems like a pretty reasonable idea. You look at the kinds of tweaks that they're making, it's in line with the kind of changes that they've made over time, even before the Common Core came. But this is where I get into the conversation about what's in the standards themselves. Again. Hello?
I lose all leverage over time when I give you this.
Thank you. I will. Okay. And anyway, so you look at the ACT and the SAT, they're not going to change dramatically. They're going to change in small ways. And for the most part, they're going to change in ways that I think most people could look at and say it's quite reasonable. We still are going to make sure we're going to be finding out whether kids can read and write and do arithmetic. And the changes are going to be, for the most part, minor. I think this is, I understand the larger symbolic concerns that people have. But they've got to address those concerns then to the College Board or to the ACT. Pulling Oklahoma out of the Common Core doesn't change anything about what the ACT and the College Board decide to do with those college entrance exams.
Thank you. Mrs. White.
Well, I think then I'll just move the needle just a little bit away from Oklahoma then, because I think one of the things that is frustrating is that, unfortunately, there are instances in which privately schooled students are being compelled to accept Common Core tests. In some states, private schools are required to administer state tests for accreditation purposes, for example. And these assessments require more than a student just being able to answer the question. The student actually has to show how they get the answer to correctly receive the full credit. So in this way, private schools can actually become coerced into teaching to the test to maintain accreditation. And how does the school teach the test without aligning their curricula, at least in part, to the Common Core? In a solid example, by the way, of overlap that I mentioned among the 4 pillars, the state longitudinal database system is actually used then to collect the private information, these test scores from private schools, in order to provide verification to the accreditation board that the school is actually worthy of continued endorsement. Now, in states such as Indiana, Ohio, and Wisconsin, for example, private schools can't participate in state voucher programs without a record of student outcomes on tests. So if, let's say, a private school wants to participate in a voucher program, they have to actually weigh the advantages then of increased enrollment through a voucher system then against the prospect of actually teaching to a Common Core aligned test, state exam, and then possibly losing existing students. Now, because homeschools most often use a traditional education methodology, the possibility for student success on Common Core aligned college entrance exams doesn't really drastically erode due to their well-rounded educational foundation. The difficulty, though, comes in when answering Common Core aligned questions in math, for example, which utilize a really confusing multi-step kind of constructivist approach as opposed to a more straightforward traditional style. Consequently, homeschools, just like private schools then, have to kind of count the cost. Do we take kind of potentially confusing curricula in order to increase our kids' chances of getting into college someplace? In states requiring homeschools, for example, to submit to state testing, and there are a number of those that actually require homeschool students to submit to state testing. Parents then would have either the option of including Common Core aligned curricula in order to increase their odds of actually doing well on the state and providing a passing grade to them, or dealing with the fallout should their kid be labeled as not proficient. So either way, the Common Core state standards become impelled upon students if there's a state testing policy involved.
Can I respond to that? Am I allowed to respond?
Well,
oh, maybe not. All right, we'll get
what
to
do
it
you
later.
think? Depends on how flexible. Why don't we save it for the closing remarks and working it into the Q&A
Okay,
from the
that
audience?
sounds good.
I'll keep things moving.
I just hope we can talk about some of the what's in the standards themselves. Yeah.
The promotional materials for tonight's debate were headlined Common Core Chaos, ? So let's talk about what is the state of play in Oklahoma now that we've rejected Common Core. You alluded to this a moment ago, but can the case be made that Oklahoma is actually worse off with all the uncertainty about standards and tests than if we had just stuck with the Common Core? Mr. Petrilli, why don't you go first?
Sure. Again, and I sincerely say this, I do hope that Oklahoma is going to find its way to a strong set of standards and a strong set of assessments. That path is unclear right now, right? My understanding is that there's now a task force that's supposed to come up with a process that's going to come up with the standards that will then eventually inform the assessments. Okay, that's a long chain. Along the way, kids are in school, right? And there is some question about what their teachers are supposed to be teaching them tomorrow, right? And what test is going to be used to judge schools and judge teachers in March, right? So that creates a lot of anxiety and a lot of question marks. Again, I hope it turns out okay. Now, it makes sense to pull the plug and kind of blow up the system, as has happened here in Oklahoma. It makes sense if the Common Core standards are so terrible. All right, but if you look at the standards and you read them, as I have, okay, as many experts around the country have, as educators in Oklahoma have, Okay, and I understand that some of you have, okay, but when you read them, in my view, you say, look, they're not perfect, they've got some problems, but they're pretty darn good. They're very strong on phonics, they're very strong on standard algorithms in the early grades, they don't let kids use calculators until they're older, they make sure that there's a big focus on content, they're the kind of standards that Don Hirsch of the Core Knowledge Foundation supports. They have some problems, but they're pretty good. So, in my perspective, yes, you are looking at a whole lot of uncertainty, and I'm not sure what the upside is. You may end up with better standards, but I don't think they're going to be dramatically better standards. And in the meantime, I think you're going to lose a couple of years, and there's going to be a whole lot of uncertainty. I also am particularly worried that you're not going to have the money to have the high-quality assessments that you could have had if you had stuck with the PARCC assessment.
Mrs. White.
Well, I think it's kind of funny because I don't see it that way. And in fact, I wonder if there's a case that can be made that says, is there anything certain about Common Core? I mean, what evidence is there that Common Core will improve student achievement? What data shows that Common Core will reduce college remediation rates? What students have even graduated from college following a steady diet of Common Core state standard-based curricula? None. There is no evidence, there's no data, there's no students, because the whole experiment is, well, it's experimental. So there has to be a case made for the converse, though, the actual chaos part, because we know the process of creating Common Core tests has been chaotic, and the process of administering even the practice tests here in school have caused chaos in all kinds of schools all across Oklahoma when it's been tried. We've seen the chaos created when parents with advanced degrees are unable to help even their elementary students with Common Core math homework. Not because they're mathematically challenged, but because the problem-solving methods make no sense. We've heard early childhood experts testify to the chaos in their classrooms created by unhealthy levels of stress exhibited in younger kids as a result of classroom work that's based on developmentally inappropriate standards. Additionally, states further along in the Common Core process than Oklahoma, like New York, are actually trying to get out of Common Core because of the chaos it's causing in their state. So why would Oklahoma not want to avoid something that's become a colossal waste of money and frustration for other states? Oklahoma needs to chart its own path, a successful one based upon excellent local standards that will build on the resiliency, tenacity, and ingenuity of Oklahomans, traits that have actually created one of the most successful economies in the entire nation at this point in time. We have a new state superintendent and a springboard forward into educational freedom off the back of Common Core repeal, and we just need to take that opportunity and run with it.
Thank you, Mrs. White. A recent editorial in the Washington Examiner made the point that, quote, Common Core combatants likely agree on few things, but there's one point on which they do agree. America's public schools are failing and have been for many years, end quote. Now, do you too agree on that point? And if so, Mrs. White, what solutions do you propose in lieu of Common Core? And Mr. Petrilli, are there any solutions you favor in addition to Common Core? Mrs. White? 3 minutes.
Well, I'm going to speak on the topic from the perspective of a former public educator and as a home educator now. And I'm going to say this, schools aren't failing. Public school policy is failing and taking education down with it. In fact, we're seeing systemic failure as one ineffective, unproductive law is replaced or augmented by another and then another in an attempt to bring about results that are largely unattainable by legislative means at all. Education legislation and programming actually features a paucity of education history and research and focuses instead on the newest trends in education, such as flipped classrooms, where teachers basically help kids with their homework in the classroom, but then the kids go home in the evening and actually get the lecture on video. Today's education focus is entirely wrong-headed. Students should not be educated for college or for the workforce. They shouldn't be subjected to latest fads. Students should be educated broadly in the arts and sciences, in history and classical literature, not subjected to restrictive curricula that emphasizes mainly math and English, which are then actually taught more like skills than for the love or joy of learning the actual topic. Students are arm-twisted and mercilessly forced into education submission by a test and punish system that robs them of their personal responsibility for their own learning. Parents then are held at arm's length and often treated as adversaries by school administration instead of the responsible party for the child's education. The only way to solve the majority of these issues is educational freedom. Freedom that allows parents to choose the school with the curriculum and set of standards that are best in line with their children's unique and individual needs. Instead of funding flowing to the school directly, funds should flow from parents to the schools in the ultimate act of educational accountability. For decades, literally decades and decades, public education has moved further and further and further away from the ones that it directly serves, which is my main contention over Common Core in the first place. It's actually time at this point to put the responsibility for education back in the hands of parents. As Einstein said, insanity is repeating the same mistakes over and over again and expecting different results. At this point, it's time for a complete paradigm shift toward personal responsibility and local control of education with parents at the helm rather than expecting it to come from above.
Mr. Petrilli.
Very well said. So first of all, I agree. Right? I agree that we absolutely need to empower parents and that we absolutely need much more parental choice in this system than we've had. That's why I'm a huge supporter of charter schools. I support vouchers. That's why in Ohio, where we do on-the-ground work, we're thrilled that Ohio has one of the most lively school choice ecosystems in the country. But those of you in Oklahoma, I think, need to get real about what's been going on in this state. Other states are making much faster progress than you are in terms of raising achievement for your young people. Now, maybe you'll say, we don't care. We don't care. It's fine if Florida sees their Latino kids make huge progress over time in their reading and math scores. We don't care. If Massachusetts goes from the middle of the pack to the top of the pack in test scores, it's just test scores. We don't care about test scores. But here's the thing. Test scores, they don't measure everything. No, far from it. Right? But we do know that they are related to all kinds of stronger outcomes in life. And particularly for low-income kids who are growing up with so few supports at home, that getting a strong education that's going to end up showing up in stronger reading achievement and stronger math achievement is likely to be the difference between having a chance at climbing the ladder to the middle class or staying poor for the rest of their life. All right? So when you look at other states that are especially helping low-income kids make huge progress, and Oklahoma just simply is not, then I think that you have to have the humility to ask the question, what is it that we might learn from some of these other states, like Florida, like Massachusetts? Now, you look at Florida under, by the way, Jeb Bush, right? They had an amazing experiment with parental choice that was a huge part of their success, and that's incredibly important. They've also had a big focus on standards and testing and accountability that has also driven these kinds of results. So let's be careful. Okay, yes, parental options. Yes, we want to make sure that education is broader than just reading and math. Okay, but let's not scoff at reforms that we see working in neighboring states that are getting good results for kids. Now, so I think we have to have an yes and approach. Yes to standards, yes to testing, yes to accountability, but also yes to parental choice. And yes, there are tensions. We have to figure out how to resolve those tensions, right? My own view is that charter schools get it pretty well. They say, you got to get results, and if you get results, then the funding follows the kids, and the parents get to have a school that meets their values, right? But if the school's not getting results in terms of kids learning, eventually that school gets shut down. That is a nice way to combine the parental choice with the standards. Are our schools failing? Most of our schools are not failing in this country. Some are. In Oklahoma, you can find some failing schools in Oklahoma, mostly in the most disadvantaged areas. The major problem that we have today is mediocrity. Right? And that has been our problem for a long time. We celebrate excellence when it comes to sports and when it comes to extracurriculars. Too many of our public schools are okay with mediocrity, and we need to raise the bar. And that is part of what we're trying to do with higher standards. Common Core is one way to do it. If you can do it through Oklahoma standards, that's great. But by the way, there's no evidence that the past standards work. There's no evidence that having kids not use the standard algorithm, which is now your state policy, works. There's no evidence that handing first graders calculators, which is now your state policy, there's no evidence that that works, right? There's no evidence that telling elementary schools you don't have to teach informational texts Unlike what Don Hirsch has been arguing for years, that we have to teach history and science and arts and music. By the way, that's what Common Core says, right? You've gone back to a policy that says, well, we're not going to explicitly demand that, right? Where's the evidence for that? Okay, look, you've taken this step. I hope you get to good standards. I suspect when you get to those good standards, they will look a lot like the Common Core. And you have a law right now that says we can't adopt standards that look anything like the Common Core. I don't know how you're going to manage that feat, because guess what's in those standards? Things like fractions and reading, right? If you go to good, high-quality standards, you're going to find that they look a lot like the Common Core. Improve them. That's fine. But let's not have so much hubris that we think that we cannot learn from what other states are doing in terms of improving achievement for kids.
Thank you. This question comes to us via Twitter. How are the Common Core state standards better when Jason Zimba himself admits the math standards are, quote, not for STEM and not for selective colleges? I trust you two know who Jason Zimba is, if perhaps not everyone in the audience does. I'll let you go first, Mr. Petrilli.
You know, when we reviewed these standards back in 2010, compared them to Oklahoma, one of the things our reviewers said was in Oklahoma, there's actually not as much advanced math content as was in the Common Core. Now look, here's the question. What are we aiming for in high school? The Common Core say we're trying to set a standard for getting kids college and career ready. And we acknowledge that college ready, of course, means something different at a community college than it's going to mean at a top tier public university versus the Ivy League. But there are some things that if you're going to end up not in remedial education, you need to get to. But that's just the floor. And it definitely should not be the ceiling. If there are schools out there that are treating it like a floor, that Algebra 2, which is basically what it goes through, is the floor, that's a problem. And other states have solved that problem by adding standards to the Common Core. Florida has done this, for example, in calculus, and those other subjects that say, for advanced students that are aiming for STEM fields or for tough colleges, they need to keep moving forward. And by the way, if they get the solid foundation that the Common Core sets, particularly in the early grades, I've got a first grader. He's in a school doing Common Core. I see it. He's getting his math facts down. I'm happy to see that. If you get the basics down, then you're going to build on that, and you should have more kids being able to do these higher level mathematics as we go forward. By the way, you have now reverted to standards that don't expect that.
Thank you, Mr. Petrilli. Mrs. White.
Well, I think that's an excellent question. I mean, I think you made a statement earlier about the fact that how do you know that the past standards actually worked? Well, the past standards actually saw a number of grades of children up into college because they had been in existence for quite some time. So there actually
happy with the results? I mean, Oklahoma's made no progress on the national assessment. You've got tons of kids in remedial education. I mean, right?
Well, I think if you'll let me finish my statement, though, then there too, I think there was at least some data on the existing standards that we had. But when you're talking about, and our governor has been wild about STEM and going around talking about how we need to focus more on STEM education and getting kids more into, technical jobs. Well, if that's the case, it's very hard to be able to say, well, we're going to do that with Common Core when the writer of the Common Core standards himself came out and said, well, these really aren't going to do what they need to do for STEM. And I understand what you're saying about using them as a floor instead of a ceiling. But again, I go back to the problem, and you actually even said this a second ago, entropy is a killer. I mean, it's very hard when you have a set of standards, and that it's almost easier to say, look, go out and create your own, because then it could be anything. But what you do when you create a box is people tend to stay in the box. They don't want to go out of the box because the box is comfortable. So I think that's what you do when you really create a set of standards in the first place, is you don't do what should be done, which is allowing, some outside of the box thinking. You create a box and people tend to stay there.
Thank you. This next question comes to us via Twitter from someone named Jean Louise. Is there proof of Common Core state standards graduation rate success? I think you alluded to this somewhat in earlier remarks. I'll let you go first.
All right, well, I think that was one of the things that one of the reasons that even state legislators here in Oklahoma were sold on the Common Core was they'll increase our graduation rates because our graduation rates have been slipping. Well, I think part of the problem that we have is the fact that we put a lot of stock into numbers. And numbers don't necessarily tell an entire story. And I think that's where I really get so frustrated with this entire notion that some greater plan can come from outer space and fit Oklahoma. Because numbers only tell a certain part of the story. What you really need to do is go to a high school and say, what exactly is going on here? I mean, why are you losing these people? The idea and notion that some preconceived calculation is going to tell a story that's actually happening is simply never going to happen. I mean, numbers are numbers for a reason, but they don't always fit those particular set of circumstances. So I think that it was a frustration with Common Core is, oh, this will increase your graduation rates. Well, there was never anything that was provided that was an indicator of how that was going to happen or how long that was going to happen or exactly what the path to making that happen was. And when in fact, what we really need to be doing, there are so many disparate high schools, as you alluded to. There are some that are in, harder neighborhoods, and there are some in very affluent neighborhoods. What we need to do is find out from those principals and those administrators in those high schools what's actually going on here. Until you figure it out and talk to those people, really numbers just are numbers.
Those numbers represent real kids, right? And again, what we know is that it is possible to do better than what we're doing today. Now, look, I absolutely agree that we need to find a way to empower people at the local level, parents, but also educators, to use their own judgment, to create wonderful schools. I want that for my own child, right? We also have to find ways to make sure that where there is good evidence, where there is good research, that we figure out ways to incorporate it. We've gone through all kinds of, as you said earlier, crazy fads in this country. This terrible period where we decided that we weren't going to teach phonics, right? And it was devastating, right? And finally, thanks to some very heroic people, by the way, this guy Reed Lyon at the NIH, who's a veteran, has gotten out of that business, is now spending his time serving veterans with PTSD coming back from Iraq and Afghanistan. Just thinking about him a lot today. But that we finally have a better way of doing it. And we have research in other areas. We know from Don Hirsch and from cognitive scientists that in elementary school, it's critically important that we teach real content to kids, that we teach history and science and art and music. And yet many elementary schools in Oklahoma and around the country have this attitude that we save that for later, right? We find out that's terrible. If kids are going to learn how to read, once they learn the phonics, they need the content, okay? So how do we try to share these kinds of research-based practices? I think that the people who wrote the Common Core did a good faith effort of trying to incorporate that kind of research into the standards. They said, for example, look, the research is that kids should not be using calculators until they are older. That's in the standards. Kids need to know the standard algorithms. That's in the standards. They need the phonics. That's in the standards. They need the content. That's in the standards, right? So that is an appropriate way to try to mix this, which is to say, yes, we want to empower local people, but we don't want to also ignore the science and say to public schools, if you don't want to teach phonics, that's fine. Because in this case, it would be like allowing hospitals to use methods that don't work anymore either. Okay, so we've got to balance that. If you start to look at the evidence, if you start to look at the research, I think you will start to come to some common answers about what the core is that's going to allow us to have success for kids. Now, can I prove to you that it's going to raise graduation rates? It's like people who say, I don't support school vouchers because you can't prove that they're going to work. And you say, well, until you let us try it, how are we ever going to prove that it works? Right, so this is the chicken and the egg. I think that the pieces of Common Core that have strong research are going to help kids. We're going to see that in coming years if they get more content, if they get especially stronger foundations in math and those math facts. I think you're going to start to see better results. But we got to let it play out to find out.
Thank you. Dr. Piper, do you want to grab a handheld mic? And we have time for a few questions from the audience before we'll let each of these two make a closing statement. I'll let you borrow mine, yeah. Mm-hmm.
Any questions from the audience? Yes.
Thanks.
Do you think one idea for the entire United States would be better, or 50 ideas from the United States would be better? And do you think that since Oklahoma has one of the strongest economies in the United States, that we might be able to pick from 50 ideas what would be best for us?
Right. So, first of all, on almost every policy issue, I prefer the 50-state approach, okay? And for many, many years, that was our approach to standards at Fordham. We reviewed them, and we said, please, states, look to the other states, the ones that are seen to be doing this best and getting good results, and adopt what they're doing, learn from them. We weren't making much progress for that for a variety of reasons. In this case, look, the states decided to come together and see if they could work together to come up with common standards in reading and math. And I think they turned out pretty well. Now you're on a path to do it yourself, that's fine. I do worry, though, about a statement in the legislation saying that we don't want it to look anything like the Common Core. Okay? It doesn't have to look exactly the same as the Common Core, but I think to say that it has to look nothing like it is to ignore all this great experience that's out there around the country as well. So I think that there's got to be a balance. And I do think that on some areas, the research is the research. Phonics works, whether in Oklahoma or California, right? As to your economy, I am glad you have a booming economy. I think that's fantastic. I think that has to do with smart approaches to low taxes. I think it has to do with the natural gas boom. I think it has to do with all kinds of things. Are you satisfied with your educational results? I wouldn't be.
Other questions? Okay.
Oh, well, I absolutely think the individual 50-state approach is best, but I'm going to even drop that down further and say that just like we were talking about college graduation rates, and I hear you say, well, I'm a little worried about this and I'm a little worried about that. Well, I can understand you being worried for your own kids. I mean, I have a number of them and I'm worried for them as well. However, there's no, a broad umbrella covering every place from Maine to Texas and California and every place in between is not necessarily going to be the approach that's going to work best at the local level. And I think the way the 50-state approach, being more like a district approach, is the best way to do it. And I really honestly believe this, because what I do agree with you, believe this or not, I do agree with you that phonics is, the research shows hands down that phonics is the best approach. And it's clear. But I think what's less clear, though, is again, because I keep coming back to graduation rates, and we had a school in our neighborhood before we moved that they spent a lot of money, millions and millions of dollars building. It was supposed to be the bigger new high school building, and it was supposed to attract all of the people from the more affluent neighborhood that was supposed to go to the school. And basically they opened the school before the school was ready, and it was populated with really good teachers, and it was populated with a really good, solid principal, and you had kids come in and run roughshod over everybody, and it scared all of the people out that would have really been able to kind of uplift that school. Now, you can pull that into some kind of, make a research paper out of that, but what you end up doing when you do that, and I know, having been a researcher for a number of years, that you can't extrapolate. And we do that a lot in America. We do that a lot for everything. I don't like Teddy Grahams, therefore no Graham products are for me. We've got to stop extrapolating over everything, because what happened in that particular high school was very specific to that one high school and the administration there. Had that administration encountered that particular population of students, which was very broad and very interesting, if they had approached that in a different way, that school would have been a much different place from the get-go. So I think every state needs to be able to develop what works for them. I believe that every district needs to be able to develop what works for them. clearly every school should develop what works for them, because what worked in this particular school, or what was thought to work in this particular school, didn't.
Right, and you know, the question is, when it comes to standards, is where is the role for standards, right? Standard being, and the challenge we're facing is that in this country, we have, for example, high school diplomas that are supposed to mean something, and maybe at one time did mean something. But without any kind of standard, you know, every local school district can decide what it takes to get a high school diploma. Suddenly, those diplomas don't mean a whole lot. People don't necessarily know, well, I know that you're a high school graduate, so that means you are definitely ready for this type of a job, or this kind of a college, or ready for military service. And so we've had to rely on something else because there was a lack of standards around that, because some communities were willing to have a lower standard than other communities, right? And we know that this was particularly pernicious where we had some communities say, well, because kids are coming from tough circumstances and in the wrong zip code and the wrong side of the tracks, we feel bad for all the challenges they've faced. We'll have a lower standard for them. Right? And so we have different standards for different kids. We have decided as a country that for a lot of reasons it's a bad idea. And so that's why we have moved to this idea of having statewide standards. And I think it's important, we have to balance that with still the local control over curriculum, over how schools are operated, over the day-to-day matters. But if there are no standards, or if the standards are all set locally in Oklahoma in 500 different school districts, then I worry that we get back to this time when we don't really have any kind of standards, and some kids are just simply not going to be held to as high expectations as others.
We'll proceed with other questions. I'll ask the candidates. I'll ask the participants at this point to give one answer each to the question so that we can have further questions here on out.
Yes, as a big 10th Amendment advocate, I would like to, I guess some of my confusion is that why does the entire United States have to be a guinea pig? Why can't we let the more progressive states who are interested in this grand experiment participate? Let's see how they do. If they don't do well, then we will know how well this standard has held up.
Yeah, no, you can, and that's the road that you're on now, and you have that right to do that. I hope that you replace the Common Core, though, with something equally good, and that the tests you use are equally good to what you would have had under the Common Core.
Well, although that wasn't really a question, I think I'd kind of like to ping off what you just said, because the idea of having a standard for every school is not the idea. But I think the thing that it is the idea, however, and where the 50-state or district approach comes in, we have the National Assessment of Educational Progress. I mean, we have a standard test. I mean, we even have ACT tests that Oklahoma pays for every year for middle schoolers to take and, you know, high schoolers to take. There are other ways to determine how students and schools, therefore, I mean, again, we're going toward extrapolating, but that is a way to determine how students are doing and relate nationally. So if there are already those instruments that are available, and they are available, and in this case we pay for them, I mean taxpayers pay for them to be used, why is it that it seems overkill for me that we're going to now have a set of tests that are you know, nationally imbued with these standards that every state should have, when really we're arguing kind of over nothing that's arguable, because we already have these other instruments in place. Therefore, if that's the case, we should be able to make some really good, reasonable comparisons among states without forcing these states and different states all into the same big box.
Next question.
Yes, Mr. Petrelli, you mentioned the word mediocrity, and you also talked a lot about standards and standardization. And to me, the word standard conveys the idea of a so to speak, a lowest common denominator that all students are expected to reach. And so my question is, how do you go beyond a culture of mediocrity just by emphasizing standards that everybody's supposed to meet?
Yeah. No, that's an excellent question. You know, and it is something we've thought a lot about. I mean, we are an organization that's done as much as anybody for focused on high-achieving kids and how can our education system do much, much better to meet their needs. And look, I think the honest answer is that we have to set, first of all, a variety of standards. Somehow we have to communicate, you know, there are some minimal standards for graduation, you know, or for being ready for college. And then there are much higher standards, you know, and we've got a patchwork of that in the country already. You know, a lot of high-achieving kids take advanced placement exams, and if you get a 5 on an advanced placement, that means you've done excellent work to meet that very high standard. And so I think having those kinds of gradations is something that's important. But you're certainly right that there is a tension that we have to work with, that we want to both raise the bar, raise the floor, you know, raise the expectations for the typical kid, while also making sure that we're making sure that every kid is pushed to fulfill their complete potential.
I loved that question because I've often thought of that same, and it goes back to my analogy of the box. If you build the box, people will get in the box. If you don't build the box, people have no place to go, and they have to find something else to do. And I think that the other thing that really kind of bounces off my thought about bouncing off of that is the fact that every time we create a set of standards, or every time we say that we're going to propel these students forward, or this is the floor, and this is what we expect from these students, and we're going to, I realize that there are a lot of parents in this country that aren't like, you know, that have to work, and there are 2-parent households that are working, there are single-parent families, there are a lot of different households in this country. But one thing that we have done in terms of mediocrity by standardizing everything is made nobody responsible for anything anymore. Because I am a homeschool parent now, but my husband and I fully intended to put our 4 kids into a school, a public school, and I was in a public school and participated in PTA, and I did all of those kinds of things. But what happened when I was in school was I expected that school to educate my children. And I never stopped to consider the notion that, oh my goodness, maybe I could be educating them additionally at home. Why would I do that? Because the school was already doing that for me. You know, I'm a Christian, and I go back to Scripture when I think about the fact that God gave you my kids, and He expressly says they're yours, and you need to raise them up in the way that they should go so that they should not depart from it. Well, that's not the school. It doesn't say in that Scripture that the school must raise the children up in the way that they should go. The more and more we take things away from parents and move them to a federal level or a state level, the less and less responsibility we give these people to have, and the more and more we cry and say, but they're not doing the right thing. We never give them the opportunity to do the right thing. We never give them the opportunity to say, you know what, school's closed today. What are you guys going to do? Oh, what if school didn't open next week? What are you going to do with your children? We don't allow private organizations to come in and help work in schools the way that they should. As a matter of fact, we have an organization here that is wonderful about, my mother's worked for them for years and years, and helped kids to read. And they do that outside of the school on a local basis. We continue, and you said the word oh, I'm on a roll now, goodness. You said the word conservative a number of times, but then we never stopped to think about the fact that having government provide any of this really isn't conservative. Why aren't we saying less government approach and more private organization approach?
We'll do 2 more questions, one here in the middle and then right behind that, I guess.
Thank you, Mr. Petrelli, for being here. Would you agree that Common Core is more than just standards?
You want to go a little further?
Let me change the question. Would you please elaborate on how the testing went in New York the first time that Common Core tests were given?
Okay, I'll answer both those questions. So the first question was about our Common Core more than standards. And I think what you're probably hinting at is whether or not they get to influence in curriculum. A few weeks ago, months ago now, I guess, Neil McCluskey and I wrote a piece together. Neil is a friend of mine, a libertarian, strong opponent of the Common Core. But we thought, could we write a piece where we can come to some agreement on the basic facts of the Common Core? And when we came to this question about, the degree that does it influence curriculum, what we said was, look, clearly the Common Core are meant to be standards, but any set of standards are going to have some influence on curriculum. Now, that does not mean that they're going to point to a single curriculum. There can be lots of different kinds of curriculum, but they certainly are meant to have some influence. So we've talked about some of that today. They say that you should teach phonics. They say that you shouldn't hand kids calculators in the early grades, and so on. So yes, the standards do, certainly, as with any set of standards, are going to have influence over curricular decisions. In my opinion, they're going to have a positive influence on those curricular decisions, and there's still a ton of leeway. There's not going to be one approach, and you can go out to the marketplace of textbook publishers and others and see there's still this huge variety of approaches. New York, I find frustrating in that they decided to rush ahead with their own tests rather than wait for the PARCC assessment, which was the one that Oklahoma was at one point going to use and that New York was going to use. Their assessment, I think, is not terribly well aligned to the Common Core, but it was also rushed 2 years ahead of everybody else's, and they also pushed very hard to make sure that the test scores were going to be connected to teacher evaluations. They gave no ground on that. Anyway, they made a number of mistakes, in my view, around implementation that have led to a lot of concerns in New York. You look at some other states like California, where it's kind of easy, smooth sailing, in part because they said we're not going to do the teacher evaluations. We're going to take our time. We're going to wait for the smarter balanced, in their case, test to come along. We're going to invest in professional development. So, this does play out 50 state by 50 state, and I think you're seeing some states make smarter choices than others.
Well, if I can just respond a little bit to that, too. I wrote a piece not very long ago, the 7 reasons that Common Core hasn't gone from Oklahoma. And I think that question actually can be created around the topic that Common Core has become the headpiece, if you will, for education reform. And I say that because you have teacher evaluations, and I have teachers who have told me this specifically and shown me online, so I know that it's true. They're being graded on Common Core in Oklahoma, though Common Core has been repealed. So now you're affecting teachers who are doing a good job in their classroom, but they're not going to get graded appropriately because they're following the law and not teaching Common Core. So that's what I meant about, Heracles defeating the Hydra, because this isn't just about standards. It's infiltrated its way into every possible thing. And I laughed just a minute ago because you said something to the effect of, well, there are plenty of books out there that aren't Common Core aligned. My son...
That's not what I didn't say that. I said there's still a variety of curriculum out there.
A variety. Well, as a homeschooling mom, I'm going to have to call foul on that, because I just the other day ordered a book for my son who has a couple of learning issues, and I ordered a book for him thinking this was going to help me teach him English in a little better way. And I get the book, and in the back it says, aligned to the Common Core state standards. Now, I know that can mean cheese or meat. It can mean nothing. But the point of the matter is that even small booksellers are now influenced in order to get into the market to create books that either say Common Core align or actually do align. And when I got this book, I know it aligned because there was nothing in the book at all about sentence mechanics. I would love to know how we're going to send children out into the world and how they're going to be able to read and write and produce something wonderful that's going to allow them to get a job when we teach them no sentence mechanics. A verb is a what? A pronoun is a what?
One last question, then Brandon, I'm going to give the mic back to you.
Thank you. How would Common Core affect children with mental or physical disabilities and other specific cases?
So, like all state standards, I don't think the Common Core would have any different effect than other state standards would have for kids with disabilities. States have had to figure out, depending on the disability, whether kids are going to take the regular tests. I mean, if somebody has a physical disability, there shouldn't be a reason that they can't necessarily take a regular Common Core test or a state assessment. If there's a cognitive disability, then there's, all kinds of alternative assessments that kids can be given instead. And there's a tension here too. I mean, a lot of special education advocates worry that if we don't include kids with disabilities in that testing system, that those kids will be invisible, that their needs won't be met, that we'll have lower expectations for them. At the same time, it's crazy if there's a kid with a significant cognitive disability to expect them to perform at the same level as other kids. So this is one of those other conundrums that we have to find our best way through. But again, the standards themselves don't necessarily change the nature of that kind of dilemma.
Well, I have to actually disagree just a little bit, because it's not maybe the standards themselves, but in Oklahoma, our testing procedure has changed. And I've had a number of teachers who teach disabled children who have said that they're just absolutely mortified, because now there's hardly any way to get a child to take a test that is going to allow them to be reasonably tested based on what their disability is. So I think just when you even talk about Common Core, going back to this man's comment about common and mediocrity, I mean, when you're trying to do one thing, you're definitely going to leave people out, and you're going to leave them out at the lowest level, and you're going to leave them out at the highest.
Thank you. Well, I knew I didn't have to say, let's get ready to rumble. You two were great. Time for just brief 2-minute closing statements from each of you. And we'll start with you, Mrs. White.
Okay. Thank you so much for coming. It's been a real joy to be able to discuss this, and thank you guys for coming out in the polar vortex this evening. And thank you guys that have been listening online and tweeting and texting. I've been seeing the messages. I think it is, as Dr. Piper said, it's imperative for us to have this discussion, because I don't care if you're a conservative or liberal, education in public education, you pay for it, and it has to be able to do what it says, and that is educate the public. We need to have these discussions to determine how it is that we're going to make that happen. But the one thing that we do need to do more than anything is recognize that as conservatives, that this isn't the place of government necessarily, and the more power that we give government, the less power that we give the people. And we can't cry when we say, when they don't rise to the occasion, because we've taken away their ability or desire to do that.
Great. Again, thank you for the invitation to be here, Jenny. Thank you, Brandon. So looking forward, you have a fantastic new state superintendent coming in. You have a process to develop new standards and new assessments. I mean, I've heard a lot of different things today. I know that there are some people in the room, and sometimes maybe I'm trying to understand where Jenny is on this, who may feel like any kind of standards are problematic, that we should not have state standards. Now, I believe it is still the policy of the state of Oklahoma that you're going to have standards in reading and math, and you're going to have statewide assessments in reading and math, and we understand the pros and cons of all of that. My hope is that as you move forward, you keep the focus on how can we develop the best possible set of standards. Okay, instead of having the mindset of how can we drive a stake through the heart of the Common Core. Okay, you have done it. You're the one state in the country that has pulled out of the Common Core. Okay, and as a statement to the federal government, you've made a strong statement. And by the way, I think it's an important statement. Okay, and it's worth celebrating. But now, demonstrate to everybody that you can, in fact, come up with better standards, even if some of those standards end up looking a lot like what's in the Common Core, because some of what's in the Common Core is pretty good. All right. Adopt what's also good from Massachusetts, adopt what's good from Indiana, adopt what's good from California. But keep the focus on what's good for kids. And I hope that's where you can go. And a year from now, maybe we can get back together again and celebrate the good work that Oklahoma is doing moving forward. Thank you.
Thank you. Please join me in thanking both of you. And thank you, audience, for your intelligent participation. Thank you, Dr. Piper, for your hospitality. Everyone drive safely. We are dismissed.
Great.